a rich man's world. I have turned the soul of this beautiful land, but that beauty a rich man's world. I have turned the soul of this beautiful land, but
Hi, welcome in everyone. I'm your host, Celeste, the community manager here at Youth Climate Lab, and I am so excited to welcome you here today to talk about a very exciting topic. I am very pleased to be joined here by Elizabeth Landau, who will be speaking to the topic of climate finance and what it means to spend your dollar wisely, navigate your spending, and especially as youth, what are some things to be aware of when it comes to greenwashing and climate finance? I would love to introduce you, Elizabeth, into the space by reading your bio. Elizabeth Landau is the co-founder and COO of GreenPortfolio. She has 10 plus years of leadership experience at both Fortune 500 companies like BASF and Anheuser-Busch and startups. She started her career in chemical engineering after earning her degree from the University of Pennsylvania, but quickly realized she wanted to apply her problem-solving skills in a business setting. She's focused on brand management, innovation, and go-to-market strategy, and earned an MBA from the NYU Stern School of Business. She is now an entrepreneur who has linked her personal interest in fighting climate change with her work at GreenPortfolio. So welcome in, Elizabeth, and we're so happy to have you here.
Thanks, Celeste. I'm really happy to be here and speak with you about this important topic. Really appreciate you having me here today. And, like you said, your money has the power to drive lasting change. Whether you bank or what you invest in matters. And you can align these financial choices to your values. So happy to be here today.
Awesome. So I'm just wondering if you'd be able to speak a bit more about GreenPortfolio and maybe elaborate on the mission and the objectives of the organization and why you do what you do with that work.
Yeah, happy to. I'm on a mission to help people understand how they can use their financial decisions as a tool to fight climate change. The idea for GreenPortfolio was actually born when my co-founder, Bonnie Gurry, was working over 10 years ago, fighting climate change in her day job, developing renewable energy projects for New York State. But her 401k was off funding fossil fuels. It was just something that seemed totally misaligned to her. And I definitely agree. But unfortunately, at that time, there weren't many options for people who were average investors to shift what they were invested in. So if you fast forward though to 2020, there were a lot more stocks, bonds, ETFs, along with checking and savings accounts even, claiming to be green and trying to help people move their money to what mattered. And this increase in options was being driven, from interest, like people like us, which is great. People were voicing their preference for financial products that were sustainable. And, based on actually a poll that Morgan Stanley did, 99% of millennials now want sustainable investments. However, greening your finances is not for the faint of heart because the process is very manual. It requires lots of reading and research, compiling your findings in a spreadsheet, and then deciding what to change and how to change it. And even further, understanding what not just millennials, but even anyone of any age group in America, really understands and thinks that these barriers to sustainable investing really are bucketed into a couple of main areas, which is the time and effort needed based on a lot of what I just explained, a lack of a way to understand or measure the impact on climate change, and greenwashing. And I knew I had to join Bonnie as a co-founder to tackle this greenwashing problem. As someone who has worked in marketing, I pride myself in responsible marketing. And greenwashing is essentially a way that companies, banks, any type of institution really can make marketing claims about the sustainability, the effect on climate change, like more like interesting language around that, but it's generally just misleading marketing claims. And unfortunately, as the interest in sustainable investing or climate-friendly banking has grown, so has the number of companies that have been trying to say they're green. And that's really what I'm on a mission to help people with today, is help people understand like what their money is up to and how to select the different investment and banking options that truly are moving the needle.
Would you be able to tell us more about greenwashing in general, and also kind of its relationship to environmental, social, and governance criteria, or as we sometimes see it, ESG? And then also, if there's any other terms that you think we should be aware of to help us in this conversation, please feel free to speak on that. Would love to know.
Sure. Before I hop into ESG, I guess I'd like to quickly talk about carbon emissions, since that's kind of an important underlying piece of information in ESG, at least in the environmental side of things. So scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are different levels of emissions reporting. And that's typically something that a company has to undertake. None of this is necessarily actually required today, but the SEC has a proposal out right now to have climate disclosures be more integrated into company reporting. So scope 1 covers direct emissions from sources owned or controlled by a company. Then scope 2 kind of goes out a layer and covers a company's emissions from purchased electricity, steam, heat, and cooling. And then scope 3 goes out even further and covers all of the indirect emissions in a company's value chain. So if they're making shampoo, for example, there's upstream and downstream emissions associated with that shampoo that you're buying. So some of it's from suppliers, so the ingredients that make that shampoo. And then there's also the downstream of shipping costs and emissions from the trucks that are bringing it to the store, where you can actually buy it, or if that's being delivered to your house. These types of emissions and what a company discloses is sometimes really integral in understanding the climate impact of a company, and it's not always reported. Scope 3 is really hard to report. It is a very complicated thing, but there are some companies now that are trying to really figure this out, which is great. So now talking about ESG, environmental, social, and governance. Many companies try to assess how they're doing, by tracking key metrics in these areas. And this is essentially how and why ESG ratings were created. ESG ratings are something that have been around for some time, but started to get popular over the past couple of years, and people started to look for investment opportunities or companies that align with their values. And so there are a lot of companies that create these ratings off of data that's disclosed by organizations. So some of that is like the scope 1, 2, 3 emissions that I mentioned, but each, has a slightly different way of doing this based on their methodology. Most of the time, you see these ratings talked about in the world of investing, but a big aspect I want to call out is that ESG ratings are tracking how a company is doing based on these factors and not on the impact that the company has on those areas. It's more to see which companies win out against their peers in the long term. So for example, we can talk about oil companies. Many have environmental ratings, so like the E component of ESG, that are 80 or 82 out of 100. So like they're getting pretty good grades, but they're oil companies. So does something seem wrong to you here? For me, it does. And so this is how you can't take ESG funds necessarily at face value. So some funds will actually still contain oil companies in their holdings because they have high ESG scores. So, definitely not the same as climate impact. And we'll talk about this a little bit more, but taking it one step further, you actually see a similar story when you look at banks. JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, a lot of them have like pretty good ESG scores, especially even in the environmental component. But what we'll talk about a little bit more is what's not being shown from an ESG rating.
So I'd love to get into some more examples and some of the more juicy stuff when it comes to what companies and specifically what banks are doing to kind of hide in this gaze of seeming green. Specifically, I think as this is kind of targeted towards our youth audience and for youth, there is a lot of buzz right now, specifically around divestment from big banks and also just calling in larger banks when it comes to their complicity in climate injustice more largely, whether that's the disrespect or the continued investment in big oil and funding pipelines and causing a lot of harm on the land and also land defenders and folks at the front line, especially Indigenous communities all across Turtle Island. I'd be really curious to know, kind of given that increasing theme and it's only going to become a larger theme, I think, of trying to green our finances but also be ethical with our dollar and where we invest. Do you have any other examples specific to these bigger banks in where they maybe try to seem a lot greener than they are without making any real changes or any like sustainable and genuinely long-term changes? Would love to hear from you on that.
The unfortunate reality is it's not just the big banks anymore that are trying to seem green, but we'll start with them. A great example I'm going to pick on JP Morgan. The best time I'd say to look out for greenwashing is on Earth Day. So a lot of stuff gets posted on Earth Day, on Instagram specifically. And you'll see, pictures of beautiful trees, commitments to sustainable development. This year, JP Morgan was asking, its Chase customers, so people like us, to go green by going paperless. Paperless statements are going to save trees and like fix the planet. That was their headline. The reality is, though, that while that's good, paperless is the way to go. JP Morgan's the leading funder of fossil fuels for the past 6 years. So since the Paris Climate Agreement was signed, they have invested a total of $382 billion into the fossil fuel industry in one way or another. So giant number. They are the biggest bank in the world. So it makes sense that they would have the largest number, but we can also look at a slightly smaller big bank like Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo on Earth Day this year posted a picture on Instagram of people, at a cleanup event, getting their hands dirty, like helping clean out the trash out of a nice, beautiful park. And I'm just going to quote them here. They said, we encourage you to get involved and be part of the change because the risk of inaction is too great to ignore. So reality here is their fossil fuel financing has actually increased annually compared to 2016. In 2016, they financed $36 billion of fossil fuel exploration. And in 2021, that number was $46 billion. So not the trend I like to see. I can go on and on talking about other big banks. We're actually working on a report right now that takes information from the Rainforest Action Network's Banking on Climate Chaos report, where they dive into the fossil fuel financing of the top 60 global banks. We're actually working on that for a smaller subset to help you understand, what's actually going on in commitments from these banks that's good, what's going on that's not so good, to make it a little bit clearer so that you can, if you have to stay with a big bank, you can make a better decision on which one maybe you should be selecting. If we talk, though, about other banks that are also trying to capitalize on everyone being interested in helping the environment, unfortunately, some of the newer players are not necessarily proving that they're doing anything that's super useful yet today. So ProPublica actually had an article about Aspiration published last fall. Aspiration, I'm not sure if you are familiar, but they are marketed as a climate-friendly bank. Their big marketing slogan was "Clean Rich is the new filthy rich." And we were really excited to see them come out on the market. But unfortunately, what ProPublica reported on is a lot of the commitments around tree planting, around reforestation that were committed and advertised by Aspiration have actually not necessarily been validated as of yet. So unfortunately, greenwashing can also occur, at these smaller banks as well. And that's why I'm really on a mission to help you get to the bottom of what these banks are doing. So we've talked a little bit about banks. I would, though, like to quickly talk about just kind of the consumer world as well, since I know we all are focused on that also. It's not my main focus as GreenPortfolio, but just something I personally kind of look at too. So if we look at what Amazon did this year for Earth Day, the whole campaign was around telling Alexa to grow a tree. And, Alexa would, plant a tree for you. Now, that sounds great. Planting trees is good. However, planting trees is not the primary way that we're going to address climate change. There's just not enough trees to plant. And then there's also a lot of science behind this. That's a whole nother topic that we can talk about another time. But Alexa would chip in money from your account to plant a tree. And this is really, I think, a way for Amazon to distract from the fact that, they have a fairly large carbon footprint because of their shipping. They have worked to try and address that with like electric vehicles, but actually their carbon footprint rose in 2020. So it's just something to keep in mind that when a bank or a brand is giving you information on tree planting or on how they're sustainable or how they're addressing carbon emissions, like you really need to continue to dive like a couple of layers below the surface to really understand what's going on.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think something that really stuck out from what you just said actually about that Amazon example is this kind of avoidance of accountability and distraction from kind of those larger systemic shifts that we really need to be prioritizing when it comes to climate work and climate mitigation and adaptation. So I really appreciate all of those examples as well. All of the examples with the banks kind of speak to this theme more generally too of accountability and what does it mean to really hold these banks accountable for the ways that they continue to increase their investments in fossil fuel financing. And I think it's interesting to turn that back on the consumer and think about, well, what does it mean for youth then, or for anyone really interested in spending money responsibly to engage with these banks? And I think youth actually sit in a very particularly interesting space because I think we all have varying levels of experience with our own personal finances and managing our money. And also I will say that maybe a lot of us are new in that world as well. And there is kind of these intersections of being young and also maybe having less access to capital, or maybe having lived experience with poverty or varying degrees of education when it comes to money management. I think that can be an interesting place to sit for youth because it makes it sometimes easier for us to be taken advantage of when it comes to our financial decisions and the ways that we're investing and the freedom that we do have to make choices that are aligned with our values. And so I'm wondering if maybe with that in mind, we can get into some ways that we as youth can really make a difference and make a change when it comes to, aligning our dollar with our climate values. And what does it mean, if there's any examples that you have, Elizabeth, around like being stronger together and kind of collectivizing and opportunities for collective action in that space too, knowing that, each of us has a role to play and also together we are able to mobilize bigger waves. So I'd be so curious to hear your thoughts on that.
So yeah, I'm happy to talk about tips on what you can look for. But I really agree with you, Celeste. Like when what you said around us, like starting off on our financial journeys, what I've been seeing and what I'm really sick of is people, brands and banks, telling us like, it's our responsibility to do this. And it is like, we want to make sure that our actions are helping the environment. But the way I see we do that is like our money matters. We vote with our money, where we spend it, where we bank, we shift it in order to really force like the banks to make the change. Because at the end of the day, I can move things as an individual. And I think this speaks to what you're asking me too around collective action. I need to make sure that where I'm banking is also making sure that the money is being put into the right places. So to get into like tips I think maybe at this point, I've started to talk about this a little bit in some of my other answers, but it is a complicated process. It is a time-consuming process. I'm working, at GreenPortfolio to help build a rating system that will help you understand what your money is up to and eliminate a lot of the time and effort that you'll have to do yourself. But we can talk about some tips that can help you with your research today. And also one thing, just keep in mind, this is for informational purposes only. So if you still have to do your own research or speak with a financial advisor. as well. So I'm just going to give this to you as tips that you can then kind of look into on your own. So looking at banks, how to look at the climate impact. The first thing to look for, and we've talked about this, is the level of fossil fuel financing of that bank. You can find this information in a bank's annual report, but to save you some time, the Rainforest Action Network has actually created a report that looks at the fossil fuel investment and financing of the 60 biggest world banks. They start from when the Paris Climate Agreement was signed up until today. And they also break it down into a lot of different sections if you want to look at like coal versus oil. But they have the summary there as well of like the amount into fossil fuel. And you can look there. It's a good resource. Another thing to look at is disclosures around climate positive investment. So the big banks do make this a little bit complicated because they all define green financing or climate positive initiatives in different ways. This is something that we're actually working on in a report that we're developing to help you kind of navigate this. But for now, you can look at this in either the annual report. Sometimes they have special impact reports that come out around like ESG frameworks, and you can start there. The other thing I want to talk about with banks is there are actually some smaller banks that exist that have more of a climate first approach. One of which is Clean Energy Credit Union. And I'll say actually in general, like credit unions are sometimes a good place to start because since they have more of a local presence, they are more focused on topics and issues that interest their customer base. But with Clean Energy Credit Union, you have to sign up to be part of an environmental group in order to be able to access an account. But usually you can find ones that are low fee annually to do that. And at Clean Energy Credit Union, they're great about reporting how much of the money has gone to electric vehicle loans, solar loans, other clean energy initiatives. And I really like that transparency. And they've also really started to show you as like a customer, like some of the people who receive those loans, like telling their stories, which I really like as well. I like to see where my money's going. So that's just one example. Another is Atmos Financial. So they're focused on making sure and committing that the money that you have in the account with them is not going towards fossil fuel investment. So that's what they're committing to. And they also have features where you can like round up and focus on climate nonprofits as well. So if we want to go and look at like investments, let's say, I think a good place to start sometimes if you're newer to the investing world and like don't want to spend a lot of time looking into like all the funds or singular stocks. You don't want to manage this on your own. I mean, obviously you can go, if you can talk to a financial coach or a financial advisor, but if you don't have the means to do that, you can choose robo-advisor. Robo-advisors are using like algorithms to help place your money based on like your risk tolerances and how much you want to invest into different types of funds and ETFs for you. And a lot of robo-advisors now have either socially responsible portfolios or climate friendly portfolios. So some of the bigger names in this space like Wealthfront, Betterment, they've started to try and get on the game. Their products tend to be kind of a mix of ESG and climate. It's not like a full climate first approach. So it's better than nothing, just being in standard. And it could be a good way to start, but it's the one that I tend to like the most right now is Carbon Collective. They are a climate first approach robo-advisor. So they kind of have an 80-20 rule around making sure that they take out the largest emitters, like out of their portfolio of stocks and funds. And then based on like your risk profile and how much you want to invest in like climate positive products versus just like the standard like S&P market, they can kind of tailor that to you in their algorithm. So robo-advisors is like one area for investments. If you're attempting to do this yourself, and I also would say that you need to do this at the robo-advisor level too, to make sure that company is doing what you want. You need to read annual reports and impact reports to determine how the assets are screened for inclusion. So if they're using ESG frameworks, we talked about that before, like, are they screening out fossil fuels or are they just using certain ESG ratings to just see what's included? You could end up with oil then if they're not screening out fossil fuels. Just one example. You want to check a fund's prospectus if it's holding fossil fuels as companies in its portfolio. Anytime you have a stock, like a fund has a set of assets it holds, different companies that it holds in it. And what you can do is look at that and see if any of the companies in there are linked to oil and gas. And then, as I mentioned and continue to mention, you really need to scrutinize ESG funds to make sure that what they're holding is actually well-intentioned towards climate impact. Because as I've mentioned, it's not necessarily the same thing that they're measuring. In terms of like collective change making, this is all stuff you can do at the individual level. I think that being, part of organizations like Youth Climate Lab really helps move the needle, because you're with a lot of people who are really interested in making an effort to address climate change. There's other organizations like this as well. One that's pretty interesting, Climate Change Makers. They focus on like an hour of action, and they give you like something to do during that to get that done. You get that sense of accomplishment, and you can move through the week knowing that you made an effort in your daily life to impact climate change. From the financial side of things, I'd say everyone's young here and we're all like starting out in career or thinking about career. I would say working for a company that's focused on addressing climate change is really important. And you don't have to be a data scientist or like a PhD in chemistry to do it. There's lots of ways everyone's skill sets can be put to use working on fighting climate change. And there's actually groups now that are focused on helping people figure out how to do that. Work on climate is one of them. Another is Climate Base. It's kind of like a LinkedIn, but for people who want to work on climate. And there's also like crowdsourcing sustainability. There's lots of different organizations popping up that you can get involved in that aren't just linked to addressing like lifestyle habits, which I think is really encouraging to see.
Yeah, thank you so much. I love that. I love that a lot. I think that was a really coherent balance too of like that individual action with the collective action. And then also kind of that balance of like working within the system and working with what we've got and kind of assessing banks as they are and working with that. And then also understanding too, and just something I wanted to name and bring into the conversation is like there are folks, like you said too, these are organizations and there are many folks mobilizing outside of systems and trying to like really move that needle and make systemic change. And there's folks at the front lines, especially Indigenous leadership right now is crucial more than ever, and just listening and kind of letting our dollar flow and be guided by the guidance of Indigenous communities and youth and leaders through and through, I think is also a really great approach. But I thank you for that. That was a really well-rounded reflection, and I am feeling motivated and just, inspired by what you were speaking to as well around collective action and just, holding close this reflection of like when you're with like-minded people, it makes the work so much less heavy and daunting, especially in the realm of finances and banks. I feel like as someone who's not too familiar with this topic, I kind of like relate to this feeling of like tapping in and being like, oh, there's no way. Like I have no possible way to make a change or any sort of like difference when it comes to big banks, and it's just beyond me, So I think it's great to hear these like real-time tips and reflections, and also holding close this idea of like this change doesn't happen overnight, and we do need to have people by our side and with us close that have similar values and actions. And also thank you for the reflection on green jobs too. I think that's a really pertinent topic right now, and just finding ways to move in a path similar to like you have done with GreenPortfolio, and working in a sector that aligns with the change you wish to make and the gifts that you hold and all the knowledge you hold. And so I want to say thank you so much for joining us, and maybe we can transition now and just wanted to hear from you if there's any final words or reflections you're holding, and also where where can we learn more, and what can we be on the lookout for when it comes to the work that you're doing with Green Portfolio, and also just kind of keeping that spirit alive of going to places for information. I just want to also name and do a quick promo and plug for the work that you and I are going to continue together with Youth Climate Lab and Green Portfolio. And there will be a webinar coming up in the near future that you can learn more about all of these really neat tips and these grounding strategies for involvement when it comes to the financial world. But with that, I'll turn it over to you, Elizabeth, to kind of close us off and let us know where you're landing and what's next.
Sure. And I agree with you. And I think you probably feel the same way. Like this, when you're working on the problem, like when personal and professional like align, at least for me, I feel like I am really making a difference. And it also eliminates a lot of the doom scrolling. I feel like I can channel my energy into something that's more positive and actionable. So I hope that everyone here, if we've been talking about finance and greenwashing there, but I really hope that you consider thinking about how you can, make adjustments and like what you're working on or like working towards to align with your values. And like, I hope that everyone can think about that. Things for Green Portfolio. So I think we're currently we'll be adding more reviews like banking options, along with like alternative investment options. I didn't really touch on that, but like crowd investing, into renewable energy projects. We'll be kind of vetting some of that and adding that to our website in the upcoming weeks. So I would encourage you to follow us on Instagram. Our handle is at Green Portfolio with an underscore after Green Portfolio. And also, you can sign up for our newsletter on greenportfolio.com. And what I'm most excited for right now is we're currently testing out the prototype of our app with people who are interested in greening their finances. Seeing people interact with our product and provide feedback has been so integral to our process. I'm doing this for everybody who, wants to be able to do this in an easier way. So like, it's really important for me to hear from people like you. I'm looking to add more people to our list of potential users. So we're planning to launch our beta in the fall. So if you're interested in that, you can sign up at greenportfolio.com/prototype. And we'll get you into the queue and hopefully add you to our list of testers.
So exciting. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think we will close for today. And thank you again so much for being here and sharing your knowledge and just the work that you do. It's really important.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed speaking with you. And I hope that everyone listening has walked away with feeling empowered that they can change the world and fight climate change with shifting their finances.
A rich man's world.